Greetings, APUSH scholars, for our review on Unit 6, Causes of the Civil War, and looking at a review sheet from top to bottom, the Compromise of 1820. Its author is Henry Clay, and the situation is the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1820 are the same compromise. Missouri is looking to come in as a state, first state to be made out of the Louisiana Purchase, and it's looking to come into the Union as a slave state, which would upset the balance in the U.S. Senate. And the compromise, which is thought up by Henry Clay, is going to be Maine comes in as a free state, Missouri comes in as a slave state, and this line at the bottom border of Missouri is extended all the way to the end of the Louisiana Purchase, 3630. Below it will be slavery, above it will be no slavery. Buys peace temporarily. Compromise is made. The Texas Revolution, or the War of Independence for Texas, precedes by about 10 years the Mexican-American War. Be aware there are two wars of Americans against Mexico. The first one is Texas will declare its independence, a number of reasons. One is the settlers were supposed to become Catholic and they were supposed to abolish slavery, neither of which they did. And as Mexican citizens, until Santa Anna takes over, Mexico is, at its inception, a democracy, but Santa Anna will overthrow the government, and the American Texans, who don't have a whole lot of intention of being Mexicans at all, now have no intention whatsoever. So Santa Anna is going to march an army up to try to make them succumb. He will kill a bunch of Americans at Goliad and at the Alamo, but an army under Sam Houston will defeat Santa Anna. For about a decade, Texas is the Lone Star Republic. In 1844, there's going to be an election where James K. Polk is going to win on a Manifest Destiny platform that we are going to spread all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Problem, though, is Mexico owns a good chunk of this western land, and we're, by the Oregon Treaty, or by a previous, the Convention of 1818, we're dividing Oregon with the Brits. So you have what's called the 5440 or fight slogan here, where the Democrats under Polk are agitating to have all of the Oregon Territory, which would be all the way up to the Yukon, kind of near Alaska, what would be current-day Alberta and British Columbia. And calmer heads will prevail, and we will divide the Oregon Territory at the 49th parallel, and the Oregon Treaty will, in 1846, will divide the Oregon Territory peacefully. But initially there is some provocation here against the Brits, arguing that we should have the whole thing. Now, the Mexican-American War will also break out the same year in 1846, and the argument's going to be ostensibly, the argument is going to be over the border between Texas and Mexico. Is it the Rio Grande River, or is it the Nueces? The Mexicans say it's a river farther north. We say it's the Rio Grande. And the Mexican army is going to attack an American military unit in the disputed area between these two rivers. And Lincoln famously, in the House of Representatives, is going to challenge the truth of Polk's assertion that American soldiers were attacked on American soil and not in disputed territory. And Lincoln, he's going to get the nickname Spotty Lincoln, because there are actually going to be a couple of these spot resolutions that he is basically challenging the president, saying that we're picking a fight, that this Americans did not die on American soil, but on soil which reasonably could be argued to be Mexican. This becomes a little besides the point. The war is declared, and from 46 to 48, the Mexican War, the Mexican-American War, is won by the United States, and it is ended by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and the Mexicans, for $15 million, turn over what's called the Mexican Cession. The Mexican Cession would be modern-day California, and the New Mexico territory gets divided between Arizona and New Mexico. And it could, if you're arguing whether or not this is a war of American aggression, if this is active predation against a weaker neighbor, you could argue perhaps that this is an accurate assessment by people like Lincoln, by the Whig Party, that this is a fight picked to spread slavery in the South. And in California, in 1848, gold is discovered at Sutter's Creek, and within a year, there's enough settlers to the 49ers, enough settlers to petition Congress for statehood. And the Wilmot Proviso is a proposal by David Wilmot of Pennsylvania in 1846 that there will be no slave states carved out of the Mexican Cession. It passes the House, but not the Senate, very similar to the 1819 Talmadge Amendment, which said there would be no slavery in Missouri. So the gauntlet is thrown down here. There's a challenge by Northern congressmen to stop slavery from spreading further in the new Mexican Cession lands. Well, compromise, the great compromiser himself, pulling another, compromise out of his bag of tricks. One piece of this is Texas surrenders its claim to New Mexico in exchange for payment of Texas war debts. But the four pieces you really should remember, and AP has asked questions on this several times about the breakdown of compromise, the ability of compromise, northern-southern goals after this war. The North is going to get two things. One is California comes in as a free state, and there is going to be the end of the slave trade, not slavery in Washington, D.C. The South is going to get a very strict, draconian Fugitive Slave Act, which is basically going to be require Northern lawmen and political people to turn over slaves that have run away. And the fourth piece, the South is going to get popular sovereignty in the Mexican Cession, with the exception of California, of course. And that is let the people, let the populace there decide on slavery, up or down, vote by the settlers themselves. And remember, there's one other compromise, one other economic proposal that comes out of the mind of Henry Clay, and that is the American system. It's this idea of an interlocking, interdependent economic system that benefits all parts. Every part gives up something. The North is going to have high tariffs to protect their industry. The South is going to have money for internal developments, things like canals and roads, and the West is going to also get internal development money for roads, and also for there'll be cheap land sales. And so Henry Clay is this mastermind. By the way, his political career is pretty much ruined by he wanted to be president. Is ruined by the Mexican-American War, which he opposed. Man of integrity, saying this was a war of aggression for the purposes of expanding slavery. The personal liberty laws following the Fugitive Slave Act are passed in many northern states, and Wisconsin comes to mind famously declaring that the Fugitive Slave Act is null and void within its borders, declaring that a state has a right to defy the national government. Shades of the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions concerning the Alien and Sedition Acts under Adams, shades of South Carolina nullifying the tariff when Jackson was president. This is a northern example of the exercise of state rights. Be aware of the economic differences between the North and the South. Before the Civil War, the South is primarily driven by export agriculture, cotton being the largest export. And the effect of this economy is going to be to retard the development of industry and certainly education, as you have large number of slaves. Why build schools for them? Contrast in the North, you have most of the industry of the United States, but you also have a more diversified economy. You do have industry, you have shipping, you have banking, you have agriculture. So when the war breaks out, the North is going to be much more able to carry the tax burden, whereas the South can't sell the cotton and you certainly can't eat it. Calhoun's idea of slavery is a positive good. Calhoun's idea of slavery here is a little bit similar to the mud cell theory in that all civilizations need a working class. There has to be somebody to do the dirty work. And furthermore, this is good and fitting for African Americans. They're best suited for this work. There's kind of that racist assessment of Black Americans. But also, there's the argument that African slaves or African American slaves are better protected than Northern wage slaves. If you're injured or hurt or get old, in the North, no factory, no business has any obligation to care for you. But in the South, you receive free food, you received a place to stay, you received clothing, you received medical care, and in your old age, a place to essentially die while you're being looked after. So Calhoun is arguing that rather than being a necessary evil, like the mudsill theory proposed, that this is a positive good, benefiting white society certainly, but black Americans as well. 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act is going to stoke Northern anger by erasing the 3630 line that divided slave and free territory in the Louisiana Purchase. Why? Because Stephen Douglas, he's an Illini senator, he's looking to build a railroad. He's got his eyes on building a transcontinental railroad from Chicago out to California. What's the South going to get out of it? Well, the South is going to get this idea of not just erasing that line, but popular sovereignty, this means of the settlers deciding whether a territory is slave or free, is going to extend north into Kansas and Nebraska. Never makes it to Nebraska, but Kansas becomes sort of the arena of conflict between slavers and free soilers. And there's going to be some killing, there's going to be fighting, the burning, the sacking of Lawrence, which is a free town. And the election is going to be stolen. There's way more free soilers, but there's going to be stuffed ballots and what are called the border ruffians, these Missourians crossing the border. And there's going to be a slave constitution set up in Lecompton, and then there's an anti-government set up in Topeka, two competing constitutions, two competing groups of settlers. This is sort of a preview, an omen of the Civil War, which is coming around the corner. The crime against Kansas speech. Charles Sumner in the Senate just lambasts the South over cramming slavery down the throats of the freemen of Kansas. In particular, he bashes Andrew Butler, who is the author, who's the author of the he's one of the supporters of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The initiator here is Stephen Douglas, but it's a real interesting speech, and he impugns the honor of Southerners, in particular Andrew Butler, who has had a stroke. And there's this comment about expectoration, which is spit. And Preston Brooks, who's a second cousin, is going to rise in the defense of his relative, and he's going to sneak up behind Charles Sumner, who's seated at a desk, and Preston Brooks is going to proceed to beat him with a cane into a coma. And this violence on the floor of the Senate also presages the looming conflict of the Civil War. 1857 Dred Scott case in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is going to rule against freedom for a slave who lived in a free territory and then moved back to a slave state, which wasn't a big surprise, but the explosive bombshell that the Supreme Court throws out and throws into the country here in 1857 is that the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional. Under the Fifth Amendment, it blocks the free movement of property, namely slaves. So in theory, you can't have any limits on slavery in the Louisiana Purchase. The implication here is you can't have any limits via popular sovereignty in the Mexican Cession either. So this becomes one more piece of kindling in this fire, which is getting ready to break out in Civil War. Harriet Beecher Stowe writes Uncle Tom's Cabin. Significance of her book is that it takes the argument of slavery out of the political, out of the philosophical realm, and puts it into a very emotional, puts it into sort of a gut-wrenching reader's experience as they read this book about the suffering of Uncle Tom, especially at the hands of Simon Legree, who at the end of the book beats Uncle Tom to death while Uncle Tom is praying for his salvation. Very romantic book, very religious book. And, it's cruelty here of the South towards its slaves. And Abraham Lincoln, later on, when he meets Harriet Beecher Stowe, sort of comments. He goes, "Oh, you're the little woman who started the war." And her book is staged. It's not just people reading it, but people are watching this. And Harriet Tubman, another Harriet to know, she is one of the conductors on the Underground Railroad, and she brings something like 60, 70 slaves to freedom in about 14 trips back and forth from the South. True American hero, Harriet Tubman. John Brown, in 1859, invaded a federal arsenal, sleepy little town of Harper's Ferry in what's now West Virginia. And he is captured. He's tried for treason against the state of Virginia, and he is convicted, and he's going to be hanged. But before he's hanged, he gives one of the greatest speeches in American history, where he's defiant to the end here that he was doing a good thing, trying to free his brothers and his black brothers. It's a great speech. Just editorial comment. William Walker and his filibustering. Filibustering is this idea of invading other countries. Comes from this idea of a filibuster comes from the Spanish filibustero, comes from the Dutch freebooter. And the idea here is you're sort of a pirate, you're a taker-overer, and he raises a mercenary army, invades northern Mexico in 1853, trying to take over Baja, and he's pushed out. Later, he raises a mercenary army of about 300 guys, and he's hired by the president of Nicaragua in a civil war, who he proceeds to oust, and he rules Nicaragua 1856 to 57. The idea here is to take over a Latin American state for the purpose of expanding slavery, and then after he's defeated there, he's going to invade Honduras, where he's going to be captured and shot before a firing squad in 1860. But this is sort of proof to Northerners that the South has as its purpose on its agenda to spread slavery, whatever the cost, even if it's interfering in other countries and overthrowing them. Again, this is proved in the Austin Manifesto. In 1854, under President Pierce, some American diplomats are in Belgium, in a place called Ostend, and they're talking to their Spanish counterpart, basically asking to buy Cuba and threatening to take it over. And again, this seems to the North to be proof that the South is imperial, it's aggressive, it's violent, it's going to spread slavery if it means attacking other countries and spilling blood. Gadsden Purchase, 1853, Santa Anna, who's back in Mexico, kind of a despicable thing, is going to sell a northern strip of his country to make some money for himself. And the Gadsden Purchase is the Mesilla Valley of southern Arizona, a little bit of New Mexico there. And this is going to be really the last piece of continental United States that is going to be the end of our expansion on the continent. 1860 election, you have four candidates. You have the Republicans are running Abraham Lincoln. The Republican platform, you need to know the platform of the Republican Party is to stop the spread of slavery into the West. It is not to end slavery. Not to end slavery in the South. It's part of the original constitutional deal. I repeat here, the goal of the Republican Party is to stop the spread of territory in the slavery in the territories. The Democratic Party splits into a northern wing. The Northern Democrats run Stephen Douglas, who is arguing for popular sovereignty. He's trying to sort of straddle, trying to split the difference here, let the settlers decide out west. And Lincoln, when he debates Douglas in 1858, when Lincoln and Douglas are running for senator of Illinois, in Freeport, Lincoln says, well, hey, the Dred Scott decision was in 57, and it struck down that idea of limiting slavery in the West. How can you be for popular sovereignty? Stephen Douglas in the Freeport Doctrine says, well, the North doesn't have to pass any laws that will support slavery as it moves into its territory. So, deprived of protections under law, slavery won't have any meaning. And it didn't make anybody in the South happy, which is why John Breckinridge is going to break off, and the Southern Democrats run a candidate who unabashedly argues slavery everywhere, all the time, especially in the West. And John Bell runs on a Union Party ticket, which is basically asking for no war, compromise is still possible, let's talk rather than fight. And Lincoln will win this election, showing the electoral power in the House, in the Electoral College, even though Lincoln only gets he gets a plurality of the popular votes, but almost 2-1, he's outvoted by the other candidates. So there you have it. There's our quick drive-by review. Good luck, Signing out, scholars.